of embarrassing story about me, so thank you for keeping it professional. And thank you everyone for being here today. I'm really delighted to be here with you, to be back in Boston, where I'm from, and especially to be a part of this lecture series that's in honor of Professor DeFleur. I actually came to Boston. Can you hear me in the back, by the way, if I stand here with my, okay. I came here right out of graduate school for the first time, so it's been 18 years, and that made me realize that I've now been studying emotion for over 18 years. And so I had the opportunity to speak about my work then, and I'm excited to have a chance to speak about where I've been over the past 18 years with you today. So what I'd like to do is just really briefly talk about why I think emotion matters. This is an area that has been somewhat understudied and unappreciated when I was in graduate school, and I think that's still the case. It's changing, but I find it a really fascinating area, so I'm hoping to convince you of that. And also to think about new and hopefully interesting novel ways that we can move where we are right now forward in the next decade, 2 decades. So if I'm fortunate enough to come back here in another 18 years, hopefully I'll have a lot more to say. But what I'd like to do is talk about 3 different areas of research that I've been working on that I think are examples of the ways in which we can move the work on emotion and media research forward. The first is to think about emotion and emotional appeals a little differently. So emotion is an independent variable, but thinking about it in a different way than we have. And I'm going to talk about a concept I'm calling emotional flow. Second, I think we can look at emotion in the context of other media theories where it hasn't been introduced and it adds a lot of value. And I'll be talking about social comparison theory as an example of how we can introduce emotion as a mediator to understand effects more fully. And then finally, it's a little different take on emotion, but rather than thinking about it as a psychological construct, which we typically do, I want to talk about it as sort of an end-state physiological construct. I'm curious what you guys will think about that work in just a little bit. But let me begin by giving you a brief orientation to my perspective on emotion, because there are different views. We can think about emotion as what they call dimensional views, where we just focus on the valence and the intensity. Right? But I take a discrete emotion perspective where we're looking at individual emotional states, and I draw very heavily from functional theories of emotion or appraisal theories of emotion, which basically argue that emotions serve adaptive functions for us. Right? The reason why we have them is they help us survive and adapt in our social world. Right? So going back just a little bit, right? Where these emotions come from, in essence, are our thoughts about the environment that we're in. So if you're in a situation and you're perceiving what's happening, those thoughts and unique patterns of thoughts are what lead to our emotional experiences. So for example, if you are crossing Mass Ave and a car is coming barreling at you, what you perceive is that you are in imminent physical danger. And as a result, you feel fear, and that then motivates you. It sets the goal to protect yourself, and it motivates you to act in a way that's consistent with that goal, which is jump out of the way, if at all possible. So these emotions come from the thoughts that we have, right? These thought patterns. We have the emotional state, it sets a goal, and then we're motivated to act in a way that's consistent with that goal. I've already described fear. We can also talk about other emotions like anger. When you experience anger, what you're perceiving in the environment is a demeaning offense, right? That someone has insulted you, they've taken your property, they've made you feel like less of a person, right? And that sets the goal that you want to reestablish your authority, you want to get back or attack that person has demeaned you, and it can lead to attack behavior. We can think about sadness. Sadness, we perceive there to be an irrevocable loss. And when we perceive there to be a loss, our goal is actually to kind of withdraw, that retreat, inaction. Right? We stay still, and it helps us process whatever this loss is so that we can move forward. And we could go through other emotions as well, but the gist is that these discrete emotions are associated with action tendencies, and that's what's especially relevant in the media domain. So bringing this into a media effects context, this is my argument about why I think emotion matters. Okay, first, we're interested ultimately in behavior, oftentimes, not always, but in health communication, political communication. We're interested in voting behaviors. We're interested in health behaviors. We're interested in how we treat one another. We're interested in action. Right? right? Well, emotion, as I just described, directs action, right? They direct our behavior. So it seems pretty like a small leap to then say, if we're interested in behavior and emotions direct behavior, we should be interested in emotion. So that's why I study emotion, and you should. It's a little bossy title, I totally get it, but you guys are Boston, I figured you could handle it. So I'm glad that's independent anyway. So what I'd like to do is take a few areas of research and describe where we've been with emotion and where I think we could go if we just factor in more of this sort of functional emotion view and appraisal theory perspective. A lot of my work is on emotion and persuasion. In fact, when you look at media research and emotion, there are very few extended lines of research. Management theory is one, but emotional appeals is one. Fear appeal research extends back, sort of more modern day scientific study of it, to the 1950s. Okay? And most of that work has looked at the cognitions that underlie what leads to an effective fear appeal. Okay? So we're really discussing cognitions rather than the actual emotional experience. There's been some research and persuasion on guilt, on humor, there's a little bit on anger, there's like one study on hope. So there's some interest in these other individual emotions beyond fear. But the question that I've been asking myself recently is the term fear appeal actually a misnomer? That is, are these emotional appeals, these fear appeals, really as emotionally monolithic as the name suggests, or could they be more nuanced? And if they are, we really need to start studying them in that way. So this leads me to the concept that I'm calling emotional flow. So it's a newer concept. We just published it about a year ago, 2 years ago. But emotional flow, I'm defining as the evolution of the emotional experience during the course of message exposure, media message, that's marked by one or more emotional shifts. And we can think about emotional shifts as either from negative to positive, so fear then relief. We can think about positive to negative, you're happy, then you're sad, or even between two negatives or two positive emotions. Okay? So this evolution of the emotional experience. And this comes from the idea of the appraisals that we have about our environment. That is, your emotions are shifting on a regular basis because your appraisals, your assessment of the environment and what's happening, and as it relates to your goals, are constantly changing. You're not really aware of it necessarily, right? You're just constantly monitoring. But if there were a very loud noise in the back, you would all turn around, right? Because your senses picked up what was that, right? You're oriented to what's happening and changes in your environment, and your emotions are going to shift along with those changes. Well, the same thing is happening with media messages, right? As a story unfolds, or as a message unfolds, and you see different stimuli, different words, different images, that your appraisals are changing, and your emotions will change as well. Okay? So this notion of emotional flow really comes from the fact that we do this all the time in our daily life. So why don't we apply that to what's happening with media messages? But what we tend to see with fear appeals is, it's a fear appeal. Let's just look at fear. What's the effect of fear? But fear appeals aren't just scary the entire time. Right? There's other information in there that can lead to different emotional experiences. When you look at the literature on emotion and persuasion, what you see is that there's an acknowledgement that other emotions are aroused, but they're kind of incidental. So for example, Jim Diller published an article 20 years ago called "Fear Appeals Do More Than Just Scare People." Right? Very simple study, showed people fear appeals, what we call fear appeals, right? But measured 8 different emotions. And what he found is that most of these public service announcements, these health ads, evoked at least 2 and many times 3 emotions. Now, he wasn't looking at very much beyond that, but just sort of recognizing, hey, there's more emotions here. How about that? And didn't really go very far. The research on guilt appeals in the media demonstrates repeatedly that the more guilt people are feeling in response to those messages that, you should donate money to these poor, kids who are starving and these animals trapped in a shelter, you should give money, right? That they also evoke anger. And that these messages tend not to work because they evoke anger. Okay? So we want to avoid anger in the context of guilt appeals. Okay? So we know that these emotional appeals that we call guilt and we call fear are doing more than just evoking those target emotions, and yet we're not studying them. So what I'm proposing is that rather than think about these emotions as sort of incidental and oftentimes damaging, what if we thought about them as emotions that we can harness so that we can design more effective persuasive appeals? So let me go back and just reassess fear appeals for just a moment. Okay? The research on fear appeals, meta-analyses, multiple meta-analyses say there are 4 cognitions that predict whether fear appeal is more likely to lead to attitude and behavior change. The first 2 are called perceived severity and perceived susceptibility. If you perceive there to be a severe threat to which you feel that you're susceptible, you will experience the emotion of fear. Next is response efficacy and self-efficacy. Is there an action that you can take that you believe will help to ameliorate this threat or protect you from this threat? And if you are high on response and self-efficacy perceptions, that is supposed to motivate adaptive action. And so you will actually wear sunscreen because you're afraid of skin cancer, but if you wear sunscreen and you can do it, that you will protect yourself from skin cancer. But what does efficacy information actually do for you? And what I would argue is that it's associated with hope. That if you believe that there is something that you can do and it's going to work, you would feel hopeful. Right? That's a different emotion from fear. Turns out hope is associated with persistence, right, in the face of difficult tasks. It motivates behavior. When you're hopeful but you feel like things are hard, hope is what allows you to persist. And if you are interested, we can talk more about the relationship between self-efficacy and hope, but in essence, self-efficacy is the belief you can do it, hope is the motivation and the driving force that you will do it. So maybe effective fear appeals aren't just ones that evoke these cognitions, maybe they evoke fear and then hope, not just fear. So this was kind of a newer idea. And so we looked in the literature, I looked in the literature, and it was like, does anyone measure hope? It turns out nobody measures hope. When they're showing a fear appeal, why would they? It's a scary message, it's a fear appeal. Why would you measure positive emotions? That would be crazy, right? Well, apparently I'm crazy, because then I did these studies where I measured hope in response to fear appeals. Actually, one of these studies it came from a data set of mine, another is a colleague who was also interested in emotion, and she just kind of turned a bunch of measures, and we realized both of our studies measured just about everything we needed to assess fear appeals. We both had hope. They both happened to be about sun safety behaviors. So we were planning this. So we have different samples, different messages, different measures, right? But they're both in the same context. And what we found, as you can see here, so study 1 was her, study 2 is mine, that hope actually positively correlated with fear appeals, with fear. So when you are feeling more anxious and uncertain, you actually feel more hopeful if there's some good news, right? That uncertainty translates into hope. And that's something that the 2 emotions have in common, that they both are evoked in context of uncertainty. Hope also correlated with self-efficacy, which we predicted. It did not associate with attitudes, which we were surprised about, but by the way, neither did fear. So we felt a little bit better about that. But hope associated with behavioral intentions at about the same level, right? And in in the second study, where I asked them a week later, so how much did you wear sunscreen, wear longer sleeves, etc., more than you usually do in the course of the past week? That hope correlated with actual behavior as well, and at the same level as fear. So hope is relevant in this context. We then ran regressions, I won't put them up here for you, but controlling on every variable in a fear appeal. So severity, susceptibility, response efficacy, self-efficacy, we put fear in there, we put interaction, we put everything in there. Hope still was predicting unique variance in the behavioral intention and behavior outcome, either as a main effect, so fear directly relating to those outcomes, or with its interaction with self-efficacy. In other words, people who believe they can do it and are motivated to do it are more likely to do it. And please keep in mind, we were not trying to evoke hope in these studies. We just happened to measure it. So what if we tried to evoke hope? Maybe our messages could be even more effective. So this is just one example of, again, emotional flow. If we shift from fear to hope, that might lead to a more effective message design. Guilt appeals. Guilt is evoked when we perceive that we violated an internalized norm, and we blame ourselves, right? So you're late, and you feel guilty. Why? Because you're not supposed to be late. It's disrespectful. Okay? And you blame yourself, oh, if I just left 5 minutes earlier, it's under my control. right? And so we feel guilt. When we feel guilt, we're motivated to make amends. We want to make reparation. Like, oh gosh, I'm so sorry, I'll buy dinner, right? And then you feel better, right? You alleviate your guilt, right? It's relief. So perhaps in guilt appeal messages, if we were to allow people not just to make them feel guilty, but to help them realize how they could feel relieved or pride, that could lead to an effective guilt appeal rather than an ineffective one. So maybe a message design in which we shift from guilt to relief or guilt to pride would work. But what we know is that guilt shifting to anger does not work. But perhaps there is a shift to a different emotional state that would be more effective to help us reach our persuasive goals. A third way that we can think about emotional flow is in the context of narratives. There's been an explosion of research on the role of narratives in persuasion since about 2000. So in the last 15 years, there have been dozens and dozens of studies. And it is well documented now that narratives are persuasive. Right? That when you read a story and there's characters and a plot that unfolds with drama and suspense, that attitudes, behaviors, and beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors shift. One of the signatures of narrative is the emotional journey, right? That they're dramatic and they engage you at an emotional level. Right? So perhaps an explanation for why it is narratives may lead to belief change, attitude change, behavior change is these shifts in emotion and the emotional journey that you might follow. So we don't have data on this yet, but it's a possibility. It's what keeps us engaged. In this theoretical piece I wrote with Melanie Green, we basically argue for how it is that emotional shifts, your either desire for them before message exposure, the shifts you feel during message exposure, and then what happens after you're done reading the story or watching the story can have influence. So, for example, you want to shift your emotional state, right? So you might seek out certain messages. Well, message exposure, if you don't have message exposure, your message has a 0% chance of having any influence, right? No one ever sees it. So if you have a message that people would potentially get a desired emotional experience, right, then you're going to get exposure, which opens up the door for influence. We then argue that during message exposure, these shifts in emotion can lead to orienting responses where you reorient. I don't know if any of you ever watched Downton Abbey. It's now sort of concluded. But that's actually like watching, oh my God, what just happened? And you are riveted to try to comprehend what just happened. So these shifts in emotion that happen as a result of these plot point shifts reorient our attention such that we're now looking at that information and encoding it in a way that we might not have had we just had that sort of emotional monotone, just sort of documentary. Sorry for no offense to anyone who's riveted by documentaries, but they don't tend to have the same kind of drama, right? So thinking about, and then afterwards, you might conclude watching whatever it is you watch. It could be a documentary, it could be a movie, it could be a novel, and you're still left feeling like, God, this was really kind of upsetting or unsettling, right? And you don't want to feel that way. Well, the desire for a shift could lead you to go online and look up more information, right? You might talk to somebody. Did you see that? I can't believe they just killed that character off. That was crazy. And when you talk about it, you rewatch, you do research, you're now engaged in processes that will influence your beliefs, your attitudes, and your behavior. So we have a number of predictions about how emotional flow could assist in influence in the context of narrative. So when we think about designing messages, for those of you interested in persuasion or public relations or advertising, if we think about what emotions do, right, what their sort of action tendencies, both the pros and the cons, we can then try to link message pieces together to create an emotional flow that can facilitate persuasive outcomes. So for example, if your goal is to get attention, right, and if you're engaged in persuasive attempts, you need to get attention to your message. Fear is really good at getting attention. Humor is really good at getting attention. But if you have strong arguments and you want people to process them carefully and really know what you're saying, well, it turns out fear's not as good at leading to deeper processing, but sadness is, and anger actually leads to deeper processing than fear does. So maybe what we need to do is get people's attention with a little bit of humor or with some fear, and then shift the emotional state through the content to something like sadness, something like anger. If we want action, oftentimes we do in persuasion, we want to get people out there behaving differently. If it's an avoidant behavior, fear might be great. But if you want to encourage someone to engage in a behavior that requires repeated effort that could be hard, that fear might not be the way to do it, but hope and even anger, depending on the context, might be more appropriate. If we want people to just share a message with people, just get people talking, get the buzz going, well, it turns out discrete emotions might not matter. It's not always about discrete emotions. The research on viral videos, on urban legends, on the sort of spreading of stories, say surprise and emotional intensity are what predict the spreading of stories. So if that's your goal, you don't have to worry about all this. Just make people feel and feel intensity. That might be enough. So there's a large research agenda that can be associated with this idea of emotional flow. We can do what I just described, look at content and how we construct messages so that we flow from one direction, from one point to another to achieve particular goals. But we also need to do things like measure emotions in sequence, in multiple sequences, at the same time. There's technology that allows us to do that wasn't necessarily available even a couple of years ago. We can look at the points of emotional shift and see, is this what people remember? Is this what they're paying attention to, what they're encoding, what they're talking about? Because if that's the case, that's where you want to put the information that is most important that your audience know. Don't put it at the beginning, don't bury it at the end. Maybe it's at the point of emotional shift. I don't know if this is true, but this is a research question, right, that we need to address. And then we can also think about, is it how high the shift is, how many shifts, the shifts between which emotions. So there's a lot of research that can be done here, but I hope that what we get from this is that we're moving away. I hope what this work can do is get us to move away from fear appeals. We feel fear, and fear works. Yes, fear works, but maybe fear works better when paired with hope and not with anger or with guilt or with sadness. And to think about it as a more complex and nuanced phenomenon that it actually is for you as the media consumer. So that's one way, so hopefully novel way of thinking about where emotion fits into media that has some legs in terms of moving forward. A second is looking at emotion as a mediator in the context of theories that we have been hearing about for decades, but don't think about emotion. So if you look at content analyses of media effects research, what are the theories that are most represented, most cited, most tested? They tend to be cultivation theory, social cognitive theory, third-person effect, uses and gratifications. These are the theories and their role of emotion is negligible. Because we're talking about theories that are developed in an era where we are cognitive, beings. Like that's what distinguishes us from the dogs and the rats studied in psychology in the 30s and 40s and 50s. We have this cognitive revolution that takes place in the 50s, and so we focus on cognition at the expense of emotion. So what I'd like to do is propose that rather than just continue to test social comparison theory and social cognitive theory and cultivation in the way that we always have and how they affect beliefs and attitudes and outcomes, but to think about what is the role of emotion in this psychological process. Where does it fit in? And I'll basically argue in the context of social comparison theory that it's not about what we think. It's about what we feel about what we think. It's not the discrepancy you perceive between yourself, and another person. It's what do you feel about that discrepancy that actually matters. So let me tell you a little bit more about social comparison theory. It was developed in the 1950s, right in the heart of the cognitive revolution, where we're thinking about how beliefs and thoughts relate to one another. And it basically suggests that we compare ourselves. It's a natural process. Where do you fit in the world? How funny are you? How smart are you? How attractive are you? How athletic are you? When it comes to things like height, it's like, yes, I am shorter than the average American woman because I'm 5'3", and the average American woman's 5'4". That's objective. But how funny are you? Well, I don't know. Am I making you laugh more than the last speaker? If I am, wait, great, I'm funny. And if you guys are laughing, I'm like, oh, well, maybe I'm not as funny as some other talks where people laugh more. And so we naturally engage in these comparison processes, okay? And we tend to compare ourselves to people who are like us on relevant dimensions. Okay? And based on the discrepancy that we perceive, it influences how we think about ourselves and how we act. Okay, so that perceived discrepancy leads to these differences in cognition and behavior. There are two different types of comparison. We can compare upward or we can compare downward, right? So typically upward comparison in media, most of the social comparison research focuses on body image, right? That you compare yourself to these idealized images in the media, these airbrushed images on magazine covers, and the celebrities who have their plastic surgery and their Botox and their makeup and hair people, right? And so they are more attractive than the average person, but you compare yourself to them and go, oh, they're more attractive than me. Now I'm feeling kind of bad about how I look, and that could then motivate me to try to change how I look, either through diet, exercise, cosmetic surgery, and the concern is that it could ultimately lead to unhealthy behaviors like disordered eating. And so that's really why I've been interested in it from a media standpoint. We can also engage in downward comparison, where I compare myself to you and I feel better about myself, right? So you might watch a program about those who are, and I'll talk in just a little bit about The Biggest Loser, right? Where you have people who are morbidly obese, and so you might watch a program like that and go, hey, I have to lose 5 pounds, but at least I don't have to lose 80 pounds. Like, I feel better about myself, right? So when we compare and we feel that we're better off, it enhances our self-esteem, and it can also motivate behavior, sometimes in altruism, where we're help people because we feel like, hey, I'm privileged and I'm going to try to help. To link this back to emotion, both in the literature, upward and downward social comparison has been linked to both positive and negative emotions. So I can compare upward, that, oh my gosh, that person's so much more attractive than me. I hope I can look like that. I can do that. You might be excited. You might be hopeful. Or you might, I hate that. Like you're jealous, you're envious, right? Or you go, oh, poor me, I'll never, like you might be sad. So you might have different negative or positive emotions. For downward comparison, you might feel pride, like, oh, I'm so much better. You might be anxious, oh God, I hope I never end up like them. Right? So you can have positive or negative emotions. And we also know from the literature that upward and downward comparison influence behaviors. What we don't know is, what's the link between these two things? Like, is it emotion that's leading to the behavior? Right? In the literature, the emotion has just been an outcome that's been measured and not linked to something else. So there's been a little bit of discussion in the literature, basically by Abraham Tesser, who is coming from a cognitive dissonance standpoint, basically saying, we do have these feelings, emotions do come up in social comparison, and that probably has an effect on our shifts, our cognitive shifts in behavior. But he never actually tested these ideas, right? So it's a theoretical idea, and really his focus is on, oh, did I go too fast? No, there we go. So there's no empirical tests of it. And he's focused more on cognitions rather than behavior, and he's not focused on multiple emotions. He talks about envy, and that's kind of it. So in this first study that I had done with a graduate student of mine, we were interested in whether these, not just the discrepancies that people feel, but are the emotions that people feel about these discrepancies, do they predict behavior? So in the study, it's in the context of cosmetic surgery makeover programs. And we had, I have a map in here. This data is a little bit older, so these shows are off the air now. But we had undergraduate women who were viewers of these kinds of programs. We said, do you watch any of these shows? And if they said yes, that's okay. Think about one of those programs and just answer the survey with that program in mind. Okay, so it's retrospective. And we asked them about the emotions they tended to feel, how much they identified with these characters. We asked them how much they socially compared. We asked whether it was self-enhancement, they feel better about themselves after watching. And we asked about their desire, all things being equal, if you have money, how much would you want each of the following sort of physical enhancements? And so this focuses on the invasive ones, like I would want Botox, I would want liposuction, I would want my ears tucked, I would want breast augmentations. We had a number of more invasive cosmetic enhancements. Our first prediction was that people who identified with these characters on these programs would be more likely to socially compare, because we compare ourselves to people who are similar to us. And we found a very healthy correlation there. So 0.45, it's a strong correlation. Okay. We then predicted that there would be a relationship between social comparison and different emotions as well as behavioral intention. And so we found that those who socially compared more reported feeling more hope, and that's pretty strong, 0.49. Right? So hope is the strongest, followed by envy, and then happiness and pity. And those who socially compared more also were more likely to say, yeah, I want more plastic surgery. Now the question is emotion mediating this relationship? That is it because people feel envy or hope or pity or happiness that we see the outcome that we do on behavior? So, I think I already said that. So what we see in this graph here is that social comparison and behavioral motivation, they were correlated. But once you put envy into the mix, social comparison relates to envy relates to behavioral motivation for plastic surgery, but this relationship between social comparison and behavioral motivation pretty much goes away. So that says the reason why social comparison is related to intentions is because of envy. Now we also looked at hope. This was interesting, that's the title of the paper. People felt a lot of hope, but the hope didn't actually relate very strongly to behavioral motivation, nor did it mediate. Maybe a little moderation. If we put hope and envy together, it's really envy that's explaining this outcome, it's not hope. And so hope is there, people feel it, but it's envy that is leading to the behavioral outcome. And you can look at the study and be like, okay, this is evidence that it's the emotion, not the cognition. It's not just the discrepancy, it's the feeling that people have that matters. But it's a survey, it's retrospective, it's cross-sectional, right? So there's issues here. So I have a second study that it's actually out of journal now, so it's not published yet. So you guys get to be some of the first to hear about it. But this is in a very different context, okay? Romantic relationships. Okay? And the question is, so we had a number of people, as I'll describe in a moment, watching romantic comedies, and the question we're asking is, how does comparison to these idealistic portrayals of relationships in the media influence people's satisfaction in their current relationship? And just as a little bit of background, some of you may be familiar, that there is research from a cultivation theory perspective that says, well, if we do a content analysis, we see that, yes, romantic genre, romantic movies do have idealized portrayal. They portray conflict too, but, the takeaway point is, you found your soulmate and you ride off into the sunset, and it's, all delightful. There's survey data, several that have come out in the past few years that say, the more people consume romantic fare, whether it's movies or television, they have more idealized beliefs about marriage, they have more idealized expectations, they have idealized views of what a partner should be, so we have these idealized expectations that are rather unrealistic, in a real relationship that extends more than just like the 2 hours of that movie. So what we did, what I was trying to do with this literature, say rather than just think about this as cultivation, maybe what's happening is that we are socially compared, right? And we watch a romantic comedy and we go, oh my gosh, that's so great. How come you aren't like that? Like, I want my partner to be like you, like that, and we might feel frustrated or angry or envious or hopeful, right? That we might feel something that could lead to certain outcomes. Okay? So the idea here is that repeated exposure, right, is really repeated social comparisons. It's not just exposure. We're doing something else, right? We're comparing. And is that in some way linked to emotions such that we might have some dissatisfaction in our relationship? So in this study, we had 120 dating couples come to the lab. Okay? And so they'd all been dating at least 6 months, so they come with their partner, and I can explain why we chose dating couples later if you'd like. This might be a little hard for you to see back there, but 3 days before coming to the lab, separately they filled out a survey that included a battery of questions, including relational satisfaction, your idealized beliefs about relationships, your expectations about relationships and marriage, but importantly, relational satisfaction with your current partner. They then came to the lab and they watched 45 minutes of either romantic comedy, suspense movies, or stand-up comedy. And then afterwards, they completed a post-test that again measured their relational satisfaction, their idealized beliefs, etc. So what I want to focus on here, just real quick, is what happens with social comparison and envy. Right? And this is just looking at those who watched romantic comedies. When we looked at group differences between suspense, stand-up, and romantic comedies, there were no differences in relational satisfaction. And so that it didn't actually change anything in the moment. But for those who, you can sort of talk to at the beginning, those who watch more romantic comedies, okay, so they watch more of it, they identified with the characters more. The more they identified with the characters, the more they socially compared. The more they socially compared, the more envy they felt. The more envy they felt, the less satisfied they were in their relationship. So it's not just the exposure, it's psychologically what are they doing with it. And it wasn't just social comparison, it was envy. And this, by the way, there are no other relationships among any of these variables, and this controls on a number of other factors I didn't put up here. But it was just that linear. Okay? So across these two studies, different contexts, cosmetic surgery versus relationships, different measures, one's more experimental, one's more survey-based, right? Or at least one has stimulus right in front of you versus not. The identification, social comparison relationships are comparable. Social comparison and envy, they're moderate to strong. Envy and whatever the dependent variable was, again, significant. It's negative here, but you can see that just because relational satisfaction went down. But we see a nice little pattern. There are, of course, limits. We only look at upward comparison. The experimental element was, didn't quite pan out as we'd hoped, but we didn't manipulate the idealized portrayals. For example, we didn't measure behavior. So I have a couple minutes. So I'm just going to really quickly tell you about study 3, which, again, we're kind of working on. But this was in the context of The Biggest Loser, and what we wanted to do here was look to see if there was upward and downward comparison. Because when we watch TV shows, we don't just watch 5 minutes, right? Like we're watching, a character, especially in a series that evolves, right? So our social comparisons might evolve. So we chose The Biggest Loser. I'm sure you're aware. This is a program in which those who are morbidly obese compete to see who can lose the most amount of weight in a certain number of weeks. And the winner, not only goes from being someone who you would likely socially compared to downward, right? Because they're not healthy, they're not a weight that is considered in our society to be attractive, and they transform into more of the societal ideal. But they also are stronger, they're also healthier, and they're richer, right, after they win. And so there's a number of ways in which we could socially compare. So there's elements I won't be talking about in this, in the talk today. But just so you know, we had 200 women who were part of the study. There were 4 conditions. We chose a season of The Biggest Loser with a woman named Michelle Aguilar, I think, who was eventually the winner, a 26-year-old woman. And we had 4 conditions. The first was a control. They watched 10 minutes of a documentary about birds, and then they answered emotion questions, and then another 10 minutes of a documentary about birds. And they were very relaxed, I'm sure, at the end of this. Another group, they watched 10 minutes of the birds, and then they watched 10 minutes of just Michelle's storyline from the beginning of the episode. We edited it together, so you see that she's overweight. She is struggling with some issues in her family. She's sad, she's very weepy, she doesn't have a lot of confidence, she's struggling physically. So there's a lot of potential for downward comparison. The third condition, they saw only 10 minutes of the end. She's strong, she's powerful, she's happy, and she eventually wins. Okay? And then the last condition, they saw 10 minutes of the beginning and then 10 minutes of the end. Okay? So just as a, quick, we measured emotion, social comparison, etc. But what I really liked about this study is that during it we had food in the room. And so we had little Dixie cups. 1 serving size of M&Ms, of goldfish, and almonds, right? And we said, and we had bottles of water. Like, it's a long study, we understand, and thank you so much for coming. And we want this to be sort of comfortable, like you're at home, and so we just have some snacks. Have it if you want, it's fine. There. And I'm sure many of them thought, well, this is probably manipulation. But the bottom line is, Some people ate, some people didn't. Actually, about 2/3 of people, I think more, ate something. And so we would measure how much they ate. So we had unhealthy food, M&Ms, we had the healthy food, almonds, and then we had the food that if you want to convince yourself like that you're eating something healthy when you're really not, like we had the goldfish crackers. So this just shows in this graph here that those who saw the beginning only, they engaged in more downward comparison compared to the other groups. And those who saw the end only had the least downward comparison. For those in the upward comparison, those who compared upwardmost, they're the group who saw only the ending. Okay? So it seems as though we do have some discrepancy here, that those who are watching only the beginning when she seems to be worse off are engaged in more downward comparison compared to those who view only the end. Okay? I will, as I'm running short on time, I will go quickly. Again, we find that envy and social comparison correlate, as does hope. We find that those who engage in upward comparison said they were more motivated to engage in health behaviors. Okay. So we're replicating, again, in an experimental context, a similar finding to what we've seen before. We find envy mediates, hope doesn't. So, at 3 different studies, 3 different contexts, different stimuli, the same stories coming out. This is really what I wanted to show you guys. What do people actually eat? Well, it turns out that the total number of food, amount of food didn't vary. Okay. But for those who socially compared more upward, what they ate was different. They were more likely to eat almonds. So they see this woman who's healthy and strong and fit, and they choose almonds. And those who are downward comparing, they chose M&Ms. They're like, I'm fine, I can eat healthy food, it's okay. But I think this is important because what it says is that our behaviors, while we're watching television, while we're exposed to movies, is influenced by the social comparison process. We haven't looked at the role of emotion in mediating this yet because it's still a newer data set. But this suggests that social comparison matters. It matters for behavior in the moment, and that emotions are important in this process. So in the future, we can continue doing the social comparison work, but what if we put emotion into cultivation, into social cognitive theory, into theory of reasoned action, into cognitive dissonance theory, that there's so many theories that we rely on in media effects and influence that aren't talking about emotion. Right? And I believe, and what I hope to do, is more work that looks at this sort of thing. I want to, and I know I don't have a lot of time here, but I want to, this is a little shorter than the other areas, but this is a very different way, I think, of looking at emotion in media from what we tend to see. So I think it's important to talk about it. There's extensive research, particularly in the health domain, right, of the effects, the cognitive effects of watching media messages. It influences what we learn. It influences our attitude. It influences our, what behaviors we might copy or model. The norms, what we expect as normative in our social group. Okay? What do all these things have in common? Right? It's all about content. And you might be thinking, well, of course it's about content because we study media messages, and we should look at content. But let me propose an alternative. Okay? What if what matters isn't so much the content, but the experience? Okay? What if the experience of consuming media is relaxing and fun? Right? Regardless of whatever it is you choose, you're enjoying yourself. If you find that experience relaxing, and that relaxation reduces your stress, and that reduced stress alleviates the negative load, physical load that stress places on your body, we might actually have better psychological and physical health regardless of what we're watching, because it's a relaxing physiological experience. And that, by the way, is a hallmark of emotion, is the physiological experience. Okay. So in this study, I was looking at cortisol, which is a stress hormone. So when you hear about the stress hormone or cortisol, the effects of cortisol, it's released from the endocrine system. When you're under stress, it spikes about 20 minutes later, but it's cumulative. If you're under chronic stress, like, you're in graduate school, or you're trying to go through final exams, or whatever it is you're going through, and your cortisol levels rise, it's going to have negative effects on your body physiologically. So it is associated with suppression of the immune system. It affects your reproductive system. It affects how you focus cognitively. It's associated with increased stomach fat, which is associated with heart disease, with diabetes. So there are some serious health repercussions associated with cortisol. So the question that I have here is, what if you watch TV and relaxes you. Wouldn't that be amazing? And this might just be me justifying that I watch way too much television. But I really wanted, I'm just going to skip over some of this in the interest of time, but let me just very quickly say about that there's very little research on cortisol in media, and basically it says, yeah, whether we show people suspense or humor, cortisol goes down. And people who have done this research go, that's weird. But from a media standpoint, it's not weird, because it means people are enjoying themselves, and that's a good thing. So this study just came out about 2 weeks ago. And again, I'm so happy. Good watching TV, be good for you. I finally have it in print. But we had 120 dating couples. Remember those other 120 dating couples? Okay, well, they're back. And really, what we were looking at here is what happens to their cortisol levels. So we measured, and I can talk about the methodology, but basically they filled out their survey of an extensive media diet. Then they came to the lab, and during the experiment, we measured their cortisol 4 different times. And so what I'm going to show you in the graph that's coming up here, we looked at the relationship of cortisol to their media consumption, right, to TV, music, and video games, because there was research out there on all 3 of those. And we also looked at genre, right? So for people who liked comedy, suspense, and how much they watched those sorts of things. And we compared it to perceived stress as well. So our goal here is to see, is there a relationship between these physiological markers and what we're watching? Does media diet influence health the way the food we eat influences health? Okay. So what you see here are the associations with TV viewing, amount of TV viewing. For the full sample, didn't do much, but for women, there's an association. The more television women watch, the lower their cortisol levels. I'm not going to try to argue causality here. But I do want to point out that association is double what the cultivation association is in meta-analyses. It's on par with fear appeal research. So this is an effect size that's comparable to many of the kinds of media effects that we have identified. Video games, the more video games that people played, the higher their cortisol. Music, there wasn't too much. So there is something here, but let me show you what happens when we look at perceived stress. There's no relationship that's the same. So the stress you think you're under is not the same as what's happening to you physiologically. So there's a little something, the more TV people watch, the more perceived stress. Okay, but again, different relationship, no overlap. What about genre? Hardly anything showed up with cortisol. Hardly anything. What if you look at perceived stress? All sorts of stuff shows up. So what we choose, oh gosh, I'm feeling so stressed out, I think I'm going to watch some comedy. Right? These were dating couples, so whenever I look at the romance one, and men are more stressed, I was thinking, oh gosh, is there a relationship that somehow affecting them? Women are less stressed watching sports, and I don't want to be gendered about it, but there's something interesting in here that we could probably discuss. But the point is that when you're under stress, perceived stress, you're probably choosing different genres. Right? But the genre is not what's influencing you physiologically. It's the physical experience of what you're doing, whether TV is more passive, video games is more active, or you're just enjoying what you're doing. And whatever the genre is, it doesn't matter. So the implications here are that our experiences and the cumulative media diet can influence our health. It is a media effect, right? But in a different way. Right? And it is emotional in that it has a physiological component to it. So not discrete emotions, but it is, I would argue, an emotional outcome because stress is emotion. Right? And again, we can talk about that more. So in the, 2 minutes here, let me just sum up by saying I believe there's a lot of exciting ways that we can integrate emotion into media effects research. That we're just at the tip of the iceberg here. We focus so much on cognition, and I think it's time for us to start thinking about where does emotion fit, that we can move traditional lines of inquiry forward, right? That have maybe stalled a little bit. We can challenge some commonly held views about how these processes unfold, and maybe we can find some new lines of inquiry that we haven't even thought about yet, but if we get creative, we can start to do that kind of research. So I will stop there. Thank you for being so patient as I wax on and on.
We do have a few minutes for a question and answer, so anyone with questions?
45 minutes. Do you think the NB might have been more if they saw like the emotional?
What we did, actually, and I wasn't clear, and so I'll clarify. Basically, what we did was we edited 3 different romantic comedies. So they watched 15 minutes of 3 different ones, and we edited a storyline with it. So for example, one of them was from Love Actually, and we actually had like just one storyline where you saw the arc of their relationship from they meet, there's conflict, and then they get together. So we tried to capture the essence of the movie. Yeah, it was a really good question.
Just real quick, when you were doing couple satisfaction for your 240 couples, were you gauging their satisfaction in the relationship together? Like, they take that survey together, or they parse it out?
They filled out the survey separately.
Okay.
So online, beforehand, they were emailed separately and they were asked to fill it out separately. When they were in the lab, after they were on the couch and watching the movie together, we put them in separate areas and they filled it out so that they were not near one another. Yeah, it's a really good question, but we actually videotaped them while they were watching the movie as well. So there's a lot to be gleaned from their nonverbals about how they comforted one another or not, or made fun of one another for their reactions or not. So there's some other data there that would be fun to look at someday.
Seems to be very interesting work. I was wondering if you looked at, as you try to increase the emotional flow up and down the path that emotion takes, whether at some point the user, the listener, participant tends to notice in a meta level that he's sort of being manipulated, maybe not very forcibly, but he's sort of being led, let me use that word. And after a few of these, tends to resent whatever is being advertised or sought after that's being promoted because of that feeling that he's being led, almost like a rat through a maze or something like that, or trained like a dog, Pavlov conditioning.
And that's a really good question, and we're not at the point of having tested it because it's a newer idea, but I think you raise a really important point, which is any time that an audience member, whether it's for commercials or public service announcements or movies, feel that they're being manipulated, they engage in reactance, right? They don't like it and they reject the message. So just like with any message construction, the issue is to have it be naturalistic and to feel like it is not, okay, we want you to feel this now and feel that now. So for something like fear appeals, there are fear appeals that are just all scary and then they stop, right? And there are many fear appeals that have that efficacy component, right? And so it could be done well or it could be done poorly. So in this case, it's saying this is a tool, right, or it's a potential message structure. The challenge then becomes how do you operationalize that message structure so that it feels natural and doesn't feel forced. Just like any movie you watch where the acting is bad or it's too preachy, you go, I don't like this is too much, right? I think it's a really good point to say the emotional flow, give it, okay, we're gonna scare you now. Now we're gonna make you feel better. Like it would be too obvious. So it does need to be so comfortable for the audience to experience and feel natural. Yeah, good, very good point. Thank you for that.
Any other questions?
One more. When you were talking in the beginning about how shift from a negative emotion to a positive one, like fear to hope, might make the message more effective, do you have any theories on situations in which a shift from negative to negative or positive to positive might also be more effective?
We don't have evidence on it necessarily, but I believe that there are contexts where that could be the case, right? So you don't always have to end on a happy note, right? And sometimes something like anger can be very motivating. So if you end with an anger, that could get people up and signing a petition and doing something and getting off their butt and taking action. So to start with something that's sad, which might, oh gosh, compassion, or like the sadness that leads to pity, that you can say, but you know what, you don't have to take this, and you can get people angry. And so that could work better than fear than hope. It just depends on context. And I think it's one of the issues that isn't talked about enough in that literature, which is there are just some contexts where you don't really need to talk about fear anymore. Like we get that, there's some health threats that are really bad, and to intentionally scare people is like that kind of manipulative, like we get that cancer's bad, like we know AIDS is bad. There are other strategies at this point in the history of those kinds of campaigns that will probably be more effective. So I would say, in answer to your question, that it's the context that we have to think about. What makes the most sense given where our audience is at, what they know, what the actual topic is, and looking at, again, that's a chart that we could develop of what does hope do, what does anger do, what does sadness do, what are the benefits of these, and think about which pieces might fit together best. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
well, thank you all very much for being here, and we do want to definitely thank Robin for wonderful.